I can still hear the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, measured and deliberate, the way they always were during his midnight rounds. The building was old enough that every step announced itself through the thin walls and narrow corridors. But Victor's steps were different. They carried intention, purpose, like he was walking towards something rather than simply patrolling. It was 11:47 when I heard him stop outside my door. I know because I had been lying there, staring at the digital clock on my nightstand, watching the minutes tick by in that restless space between sleep and wakefulness that had become my normal state. The knock came soft but firm, 3 measure taps that somehow managed to sound both professional and personal. I pulled on a t-shirt and padded to the door, my bare feet silent against the cold linoleum. Through the peephole, Victor stood bathed in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, his security uniform crisp despite the late hour. His face was calm, unreadable in that way I'd come to recognize over the months since I'd moved into this weathered building on the edge of campus. I opened the door, and the familiar weight of his presence filled the doorway. Victor was the kind of man who took up space without trying, broad shoulders and steady posture that spoke of someone who had learned to be both protector and observer. His dark hair was starting to show silver at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that suggested he had been watching over things for longer than just this building. Checking the alarms, he said simply, his voice carrying that quiet authority I had grown accustomed to hearing echo through the halls during his nightly rounds. His flashlight hung loose in his left hand. The beam pointed toward the floor, casting shadows that danced across the scuffed walls. I stepped back, allowing him into the narrow entryway of my apartment. The space felt smaller with him in it, more contained, as if his presence had somehow compressed the air. He moved past me with the careful efficiency of someone who knew how to navigate small spaces without disturbing them, heading directly to the alarm panel mounted beside my door. The panel was old, installed decades ago, when the building still housed families instead of graduate students scraping together rent money. Its plastic casing had yellowed with age, and the tiny LED lights blinked with an inconsistent rhythm that I had learned to ignore. But Victor approached it with the attention of someone who understood that these small details mattered, that the difference between safety and vulnerability often came down to whether someone bothered to check. He pressed the test button, and a sharp beep cut through the quiet of my apartment. The sound was too loud, too sudden, and I found myself holding my breath as we both waited for the confirming chirp that would signal everything was working as it should. The seconds stretched out, filled with the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Then came the answering beep, steady and reassuring. Victor nodded, satisfied, but instead of leaving, he reached for my door handle. The lock was a simple deadbolt, the kind that came standard in buildings like this one, designed more for the illusion of security than actual protection. He turned it slowly, deliberately, and the click seemed to echo through the small space with unusual weight. I watched his hands as he worked. They were large, calloused, the hands of someone who had spent years fixing things, maintaining them, keeping them running when they wanted to break down. There was something hypnotic about the careful way he moved, as if every action had been considered, planned, executed with purpose. The lock clicked into place, then clicked again as he turned it back. He was testing it, I realized, making sure it engaged properly, that it would hold when it needed to. But there was something else in the gesture, something that made my pulse quicken in a way I didn't entirely understand. Then he leaned closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath, the clean soap smell of his shirt. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, meant only for me in the hush of the late hour. "If yours ever fails," he said, the words brushing against my ear with warmth that seemed to spread through my chest. "Use mine." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift in the small space of my entryway. It was not really about the alarm, was it? Not about the lock or the building's aging security system or his responsibilities as the night watchman. There was an invitation in those words, an offering that went deeper than the practical matter of faulty electronics and backup plans. I found myself studying his face in the dim light spilling in from the hallway. Victor's eyes were dark, serious, with an intensity that made me feel like he was seeing something in me I hadn't shown him. We had shared brief exchanges over the months, the kind of polite interactions that happened between tenants and building staff. A nod when we passed on the stairs. A comment about the weather when he checked the mailboxes. Small acknowledgments that had somehow accumulated into something more substantial, though I had never named it. Now, standing close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, I understood that those small moments had been building toward this one. That every measured step in the hallway, every careful nod, every moment when his gaze lingered a beat longer than necessary had been preparation for this quiet offering in my doorway at nearly midnight. The building settled around us with the creaks and sighs of old wood and shifting foundations. Somewhere down the hall, a tenant's television murmured through thin walls. The refrigerator cycled on with a mechanical hum. Normal sounds of a normal night, but they felt distant now, muted by the weight of what had just passed between us. I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to ask if he made this offer to other tenants, if this was part of his standard security protocol, if I was reading too much into words that might have been purely practical. But looking at his face, at the way his eyes held mine with steady certainty, I already knew the answers. This was not standard protocol. This was not practical. This was Victor, the quiet watchman who saw everything and said little, offering me something that felt like trust and invitation and promise all woven together in a few whispered words. He stepped back, returning to the professional distance that usually existed between us, but the space felt charged now, electric with possibility. The flashlight beams swept briefly across the floor as he adjusted his grip, and I watched the play of light and shadow across his uniform, the way it highlighted the breadth of his shoulders, the steady line of his jaw. "Have a good night," he said, his voice returning to its normal tone, though I thought I detected something softer in it now, something meant just for me. He turned to go, his footsteps resuming their measured pace as he continued his rounds, checking the other apartments, other alarms, other locks. But the sound of his steps faded into the background noise of the building. I remained standing in my doorway, my hand resting on the doorframe, still feeling the warmth of his breath against my ear. The words echoed in the quiet of my apartment. Use mine. Two simple words that had shifted something fundamental in the careful distance I had maintained between myself and the world. I closed the door and turned the lock, hearing the familiar click with new awareness. The alarm panel blinked its steady rhythm, the same as always, but somehow it felt different now. More significant. A connection to something larger than my small, contained life. That night, I lay awake long after the building had settled into silence, thinking about keys and locks and the difference between safety and isolation. Thinking about the weight of trust and what it meant when someone like Victor offered it so quietly, so completely, in the hush of a midnight hallway. I had been living in apartment 2B for 8 months when Victor made his offer, though it felt like I had been waiting for something to happen much longer than that. The building was one of those narrow brick structures that lined the streets near campus, the kind that had probably housed families once, but had been carved up into small units for students who needed cheap rent and didn't mind thin walls or unreliable heat. My apartment was barely 400 square feet, a converted space that might have originally been a large bedroom in whatever house this building used to be. The kitchen was a galley so narrow I could touch both walls with my arms outstretched. The bathroom had a shower stall that required careful choreography to use without bumping my elbows. The main rooms served as bedroom, living room, and study with my desk pushed against the window that looked out onto the fire escape and the brick wall of the building next door. I was 22 and in my second year of graduate school, studying literature with a focus on contemporary fiction. My days were spent in library carols and seminar rooms, analyzing the ways other people had learned to write about longing and connection and the spaces between what people said and what they meant. My evenings were spent in my small apartment, reading until my eyes burned, writing papers that felt increasingly disconnected from anything that mattered, eating meals I prepared without thought or pleasure. It was a contained life, carefully constructed to minimize risk and complication. I had learned early that keeping quiet, keeping small, keeping to myself was the safest way to move through the world. In high school, I had been the kid who ate lunch in the library, who walked the long way to classes to avoid the crowded hallways, who had perfected the art of being present but unnoticed. College had offered more freedom, but I had carried those habits with me like protective armor. In this building, I was the tenant who never complained about the radiator that clanked through the night, or the upstairs neighbor who played music too loud, or the way the front door lock stuck in cold weather. I paid my rent on time, kept my space clean and quiet, nodded politely when I encountered other residents in the narrow hallways. I existed in the margins, the way I always had. But Victor had noticed me anyway. He was 30. I had learned from brief conversations, though he carried himself with the steady certainty of someone older. He had been the night watchman for 3 years. Hired after a series of break-ins, had made the landlord realize that a building full of distracted students needed someone keeping watch. His shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and during those hours, he was the only authority in the building, the person responsible for everyone's safety. Victor was built like someone who had done physical work his whole life, broad through the shoulders and chest, with forearms that spoke of years lifting and fixing and maintaining. His hands were always clean but showed the calluses and small scars of someone who worked with tools, who understood how things were put together and why they came apart. His hair was dark brown with that premature silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than aging, and his eyes were the kind of deep brown that seemed to see more than they revealed. He moved through the building with quiet authority, checking locks and testing alarms and noting the small details that other people overlooked. A loose banister on the stairway, a burnt-out bulb in the basement, a window that didn't quite close properly. He kept a notebook where he recorded these observations, and I had seen him talking to the super during the day shift, making sure things got fixed before they became problems. To most tenants, Victor was background, part of the building's infrastructure like the heating system or the mailboxes. They felt safer knowing he was there, but they didn't really see him, didn't think about the fact that he spent every night walking these halls while they slept, that he knew the sounds of their lives in ways they never considered. But I had always been aware of him, from my first week in the building. Maybe it was because I was often awake during his rounds, lying in bed listening to the familiar sounds of his footsteps in the hallway. Maybe it was because I understood what it meant to be the person watching while everyone else went about their lives, unaware of being observed. Maybe it was something else entirely, something I hadn't been ready to name. Our interactions had been brief, but somehow weighted with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. He would nod when we passed on the stairs, and the gesture felt more like recognition than simple politeness. When I checked my mail, and he was checking the building's mailbox locks, he might comment on the weather, and his voice would carry a warmth that seemed meant specifically for me. Once, when I was struggling with grocery bags and my key, he had appeared beside me and steadied the bags while I unlocked my door, his presence solid and reassuring. These moments had accumulated over the months, building into something I felt but couldn't articulate. Victor saw me in a way that other people didn't, with an attention that made me feel both exposed and safe. When he looked at me, I had the sense that he was seeing not just the quiet graduate student in apartment 2B, but something deeper, something I kept hidden even from myself. Now, after his midnight visit, after those whispered words about using his key, I understood that the weight I had felt in our brief encounters had been mutual, that the careful attention, the moments of extended eye contact, the way he seemed to slow his pace when he passed my door, had all been leading to this offering of trust and access, and something that felt dangerously close to invitation. The gravity he had mentioned, the pull that had drawn me to linger in hallways and time my trips to the mailbox to coincide with his rounds, had been drawing him toward me as well. And now he had given me a key, had offered me his space, his sanctuary, had whispered words that suggested he understood exactly what he was offering and what it might mean. The key felt heavier than it should have in my pocket as I walked to campus the next morning, a constant weight that reminded me of Victor's whispered words every time I shifted or reached for something. I found myself distracted during my seminar on narrative structure, my professor's voice fading into background noise as I thought about locks and keys and the difference between invitation and instruction. That evening, I couldn't concentrate on the paper I was supposed to be writing about unreliable narrators in contemporary fiction. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was struggling to analyze stories about characters who couldn't be trusted to tell the truth, while I was avoiding examining the truth of what had happened in my doorway the night before. I kept reading the same paragraph over and over, the words blurring together as my mind wandered to the sound of Victor's footsteps in the hallway. I found myself listening for those footsteps earlier than usual, positioning myself near my door around 10:30, pretending to organize the small pile of mail on my kitchen counter. When I heard him beginning his rounds on the floor above, I felt my pulse quicken in a way that seemed disproportionate to the simple fact of his presence in the building. But knowing he was there, knowing he would pass my door, knowing he had given me something that connected us in a way that went beyond tenant and security guard had changed the rhythm of my evening routine. At 11:15, I heard him coming down the stairs. His footsteps were the same measured pace as always, but I imagined I could detect something different in them, a slight hesitation as he reached the second-floor landing. I waited, counting the seconds, and then opened my door as if I had been heading out to check my mailbox. The timing was too convenient to be accidental, and we both knew it. Victor paused in the hallway, his flashlight lowered, and looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than I was ready to reveal. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed softly, casting its harsh illumination across the narrow space between us. I felt foolish standing there with my empty hands, having abandoned the pretense of checking mail the moment I saw him. The silence stretched out, filled with the distant sound of a television from one of the other apartments and the steady hum of the building's heating system. I wanted to say something, anything to justify why I had opened my door at exactly the moment he was passing, but the words wouldn't come. "You sleep okay?" he asked finally, his voice carrying that same quiet authority I had heard the night before, but softer now, as if the question was meant for something deeper than surface politeness. The question was simple enough, but it felt loaded with significance. I slept okay. Had I been able to rest after he left, after he had offered me his key and whispered those words that had shifted something fundamental in my carefully ordered world? Had I been lying awake thinking about what it meant the way I suspected he knew I had? "Fine," I said, though my chest felt tight as I spoke the word. Fine was such an inadequate response to what I was actually feeling, which was a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty and something that felt dangerously close to hope. But fine was safe, neutral, the kind of answer that could mean anything or nothing depending on how it was received. Victor studied me for a moment that felt much longer than it probably was. His gaze moved across my face with the same careful attention he brought to checking locks and testing alarms, as if he were trying to determine whether I was functioning properly, whether I needed maintenance or repair. There was something almost tender in that scrutiny, a concern that went beyond professional responsibility. Then, without saying anything else, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. It was brass, worn smooth from years of use, hanging from a simple key ring that looked like it had been carried in working pockets for a long time. He held it out to me, not quite close enough that I would have to reach for it, but close enough that the gesture was unmistakable. "In case you ever don't," he said simply. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt the weight of what he was offering settle in my chest like something physical. This wasn't about backup security systems or building protocols. This was Victor giving me access to his private space, his refuge, the place where he went when his shift ended and he needed to rest. This was trust made tangible, an invitation wrapped in practical language but carrying emotional weight that made my hands tremble slightly as I reached out to take it. The metal was warm from his pocket, and when our fingers brushed during the transfer, I felt a jolt of connection that seemed out of proportion to such brief contact. But Victor didn't pull his hand away immediately, and for a moment we stood there in the hallway with our fingers touching and the key between us, a small piece of brass that represented something much larger than its physical form. I didn't ask what it meant. The question felt unnecessary, almost insulting to the quiet understanding that had been building between us over months of careful glances, and measured words. I already knew what it meant, just as I knew that accepting it would change things between us in ways I couldn't predict or control. "Thank you," I said instead, closing my fingers around the key and feeling its weight settle into my palm. The words felt inadequate, too small for what he had just given me. But they were all I could manage in the fluorescent-lit hallway with the buildings settling around us and the knowledge that we had just crossed some invisible line that separated professional courtesy from personal connection. Victor nodded, a slight movement that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and something that might have been relief. He stepped back, restoring the physical distance between us, but the space felt different now, charged with the knowledge of what had just passed between us. He continued his rounds, his footsteps resuming their steady rhythm as he moved down the hallway to check the other apartments. But I remained standing in my doorway long after he had disappeared around the corner, the key warm in my palm and my heart beating with a rhythm that felt entirely different from the careful, controlled pace I had maintained for so long. For 3 days, the key lived on my nightstand, catching the light from the window each morning and reminding me of its presence each night before I turned off the lamp. I would pick it up sometimes, feeling its weight, running my thumb across the warm brass surface, but I couldn't bring myself to use it. The possession of it was enough, somehow. Knowing I could cross the hallway if I wanted to, knowing Victor had given me that option, had changed the quality of my solitude without requiring me to act on it. My apartment felt different with the key nearby. The silence was less oppressive, the small space less confining. When I lay in bed at night, listening to Victor's footsteps during his rounds, I no longer felt like I was merely existing in parallel to his world. The key connected us, made me part of his domain in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. On Wednesday evening, I was reading at my desk when the lights flickered, once, twice, then steadied. I looked up from my book, noting the time on my clock, 10:45. The building's electrical system had always been unreliable, prone to fluctuations during storms or when too many people were running space heaters, but tonight the weather was clear and the power draw shouldn't have been excessive. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and I heard the hum of the refrigerator stutter and resume. Then the alarm panel by my door began to emit a different sound than its usual steady beep. Instead of the regular rhythm I had grown accustomed to, it produced an erratic chirping, like a smoke detector with a dying battery. I walked over to examine it, noting the way the LED lights blinked in an irregular pattern. The display that normally showed a steady green light was flashing red, and when I pressed the test button the way I'd seen Victor do, nothing happened. The system was failing, exactly as he had anticipated it might. The power flickered once more, and this time stayed off for nearly 10 seconds before returning. In that brief darkness, I understood that this was more than a simple electrical hiccup. Something was wrong with the building's systems, and my alarm, my primary connection to security and safety, was no longer functioning. I stood in my small entryway, looking at the malfunctioning panel, and thought about Victor's words from that first night. "If yours ever fails, use mine." At the time, those words had felt theoretical, a hypothetical offering wrapped in practical concern. Now, they felt immediate, necessary, a solution to a problem that was unfolding in real time. Outside, rain began to fall, light at first, but quickly intensifying into the kind of storm that made the building's old windows rattle in their frames. The wind picked up, and I could hear it whistling through the gaps around my window, the same window that looked out onto the fire escape and the narrow alley between buildings. The darkness beyond the glass felt more threatening now, knowing that my alarm system was compromised. I went to my nightstand and picked up the key, feeling its familiar weight settle into my palm. The decision felt both inevitable and momentous. This was what Victor had offered, what he had anticipated might happen. But using the key would mean crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross, accepting an intimacy that went beyond the careful distance we had maintained despite the undercurrent of attraction between us. The storm intensified, and the lights flickered again. This time they stayed off longer, and when they returned, the alarm panel was completely dark. No lights, no sounds, no indication that it was functioning at all. The building felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed in a way that made my carefully constructed sense of safety crumble. I put on my shoes and walked to my door, the key clutched tight in my hand. The hallway was dimly lit by the emergency lighting that had kicked in during the power fluctuations, casting everything in an amber glow that made the familiar space feel foreign and uncertain. The distance to Victor's door, directly across from mine, seemed both impossibly short and infinitely long. I stood there for a moment, key in hand, listening to the storm and the building's unsettled sounds. This was the moment Victor had prepared me for, though I wondered if he had known it would come so soon, if he had sensed the building's systems were more fragile than they appeared. Or perhaps he had simply understood that storms, both literal and metaphorical, were inevitable, and that preparation was the difference between safety and vulnerability. I crossed the hallway and stood before his door, solid wood painted the same institutional beige as mine, but somehow more substantial, more permanent. The key slid into the lock easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment, and turned with a smooth click that seemed to echo more loudly than it should have in the quiet corridor. I pushed the door open and stepped into Victor's space, feeling immediately that I was entering a world entirely different from my own. Where my apartment was cramped and cluttered with books and papers, his was spare and organized, furnished with purpose rather than convenience. The single room was larger than mine, though still modest, with a neatly made bed against one wall and a small kitchenette that looked actually functional rather than merely adequate. Victor was sitting in a chair near the window, still in his uniform, but with his duty belt hung carefully on a hook by the door. He looked up when I entered, and his expression was calm, unsurprised, as if he had been expecting me, as if he had known that the storm would come, that my alarm would fail, that I would find myself standing in his doorway with his key in my hand and uncertainty written across my face. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken understanding and a knowledge that whatever happened next would define the shape of whatever this was becoming between us. The storm rattled the windows, but inside Victor's room, surrounded by his quiet presence and the solid reliability of his space, I felt safer than I had in my own apartment. The key had done exactly what he had promised it would do. It had given me sanctuary when mine had failed. Victor gestured toward the small couch against the far wall, a simple piece of furniture that looked like it had been chosen for function rather than style. I moved toward it carefully, still clutching his key, hyper-aware of every step in this space that belonged to him. The room smelled faintly of coffee and something else I couldn't identify, something clean and masculine that spoke of careful maintenance and quiet routine. He followed me to the couch and sat down beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not so close that we were touching. The cushions dipped slightly under his weight, and I found myself acutely aware of the small distance between us, the way his presence seemed to fill the space without overwhelming it. The storm outside grew more intense, rain lashing against the windows with increasing force. Thunder rolled overhead, deep and resonant, making the building shudder slightly in response. But inside Victor's room, the sounds felt distant, muted by the solid walls and his quiet presence. The emergency lighting in the hallway flickered occasionally, visible through the gap under his door, but his room remained steadily lit by a small lamp beside his bed. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the storm and the building's responses to it. I could hear pipes creaking somewhere in the walls, the sound of wind finding gaps in the structure, the distant hum of the backup generator that had apparently kicked in to maintain essential systems. But the cacophony felt manageable here, contained by Victor's calm presence and the sense of security his space provided. Finally, I found the courage to break the silence. The question had been building inside me since that first night when he offered me his key, growing more urgent with each passing day, each careful glance, each moment of connection that felt too weighted to be casual. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "Why give me this?" The words hung in the air between us, and I saw Victor's jaw tighten slightly. He didn't answer immediately, and I wondered if I had overstepped, if I had asked for more honesty than he was prepared to give. But then he turned to look at me directly, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Because you're the only one I'd let in," he said simply, his voice low and steady, but carrying a weight that made the simple words feel like a confession. The admission hit me with surprising force. In all the months of careful observation, of noting the way he moved through the building with professional distance, of watching him maintain boundaries with tenants who tried to engage him in personal conversation, I had never considered that his reserve might be protective rather than merely professional, that his careful distance might be a choice rather than a disposition. I thought about the other tenants in the building, the graduate students who treated him like part of the infrastructure, the older residents who sometimes tried to chat with him during his rounds, the young women who occasionally lingered in the hallway when they heard his footsteps. Victor was polite to all of them, professional, reliable, but he had never offered any of them what he had offered me. Even now, I asked, surprised by the vulnerability in my own voice. The question encompassed everything I couldn't quite articulate. Even now, when letting me in meant crossing boundaries between professional and personal. Even now, when giving me his key meant admitting that whatever existed between us was more than casual connection. Even now, when my presence in his private space during a storm carried implications that neither of us could ignore. Especially now, he said, and his gaze didn't waver from mine. The truth of his words settled in the space between us, heavy as the thunder that continued to roll overhead. Especially now, when the storm had provided the catalyst for me to use his key, when the failing alarm system had given us a practical reason for what we both knew was anything but practical. Especially now, when sitting beside him in his quiet room felt like the most natural thing in the world, despite the fact that we had never been this close, this intimate, this honest with each other. I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I had been carrying. For months, I had been careful to read nothing into our interactions beyond what was explicitly stated, to interpret his attention as professional interest, to convince myself that any attraction was one-sided. But his words confirmed what I had hoped but hadn't dared to believe, that the careful attention had been mutual, that the weight I felt in our brief encounters had been shared. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside Victor's room, surrounded by his presence and the solid reality of his confession, I felt something settling into place. The key in my hand no longer felt like a foreign object, but like something that belonged there, something that connected me to this space and this man in ways I was only beginning to understand. Victor reached over then, slowly, deliberately, and covered my hand with his. His palm was warm and calloused, larger than mine, and when his fingers closed gently around the hand that held his key, I felt a connection that went deeper than the simple touch. It was acknowledgement, acceptance, a physical manifestation of the trust and invitation he had been offering in words. We sat like that as the storm raged around us, his hand covering mine, the key between our palms, and the weight of his confession settling into the quiet spaces of his room. The silence was no longer empty, but full, pregnant with possibility and the understanding that we had crossed some essential threshold. That whatever happened next, we were no longer tenant and security guard, no longer strangers who happened to share the same building. We were something else now, something undefined but real, connected by brass and trust, and the courage to finally name what had been growing between us in the shadows of midnight rounds and careful glances. The storm would pass, the power would be restored, the alarm systems would be repaired. But this moment, this confession, this quiet acknowledgement of what we meant to each other would remain solid and permanent as the key that had brought us together. The storm rattled the windows with renewed intensity, as if the building itself was responding to the shift in the air between us. Victor's hand remained covering mine, steady and warm, but I could feel the tension in his fingers, the way he was holding himself carefully in check. The confession had changed something fundamental in the small space of his room, had acknowledged what we both had been dancing around for months, but it had also created a new kind of uncertainty. I looked down at our joined hands, at the way his fingers had curved around mine with such deliberate gentleness, as if he were afraid I might pull away. The key was still pressed between our palms, its metal surface warmed by our shared heat, a tangible reminder of the trust he had placed in me and the threshold I had crossed by using it. The weight of the moment settled in my chest, heavy and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. We were alone in his private space during a storm that showed no signs of abating, having just admitted to feelings that neither of us had been willing to name before tonight. The careful distance we had maintained, the professional boundaries that had kept us safely separated, had dissolved entirely. Thunder crashed overhead, closer this time, making the building shudder in response. The lights flickered briefly, and for a moment we were plunged into near darkness before they steadied again. In that brief interruption, I felt Victor's grip on my hand tighten slightly, a protective instinct that sent warmth spreading through my chest. When the lights returned, I found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was concern there and tenderness, but also something that looked like restraint, as if he were fighting some internal battle about what was appropriate, what was safe, what was right in this situation we had created. The storm outside seemed to be growing more violent by the minute, rain lashing against the windows with increasing force, wind howling through the building's exterior in ways that made me grateful to be inside, to be here with him rather than alone in my apartment, with its failing alarm system and thin walls. But the storm inside me felt equally intense, a churning mixture of desire and uncertainty and the overwhelming awareness of Victor's presence beside me. I turned toward him, shifting slightly on the couch so that I could see his face more clearly. The movement brought us closer together, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the careful way he was watching me as if trying to determine what I needed from him in this moment. And what if I don't want to leave? I heard myself say, the words emerging before I had fully formed the thought. They hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that made my heart race and my hands tremble slightly where they were joined with his. The question encompassed everything I couldn't quite articulate. What if I wanted to stay here, not just until the storm passed, but longer? What if I wanted to cross the remaining distance between us, to act on the attraction that had been building for months beneath the surface of our careful interactions? What if I wanted to explore what this connection might become when stripped of the professional boundaries that had contained it? Victor's eyes softened at my words, and I saw something shift in his expression, a gentleness that transformed his usually serious features into something more vulnerable, more open. His free hand moved slowly, deliberately, until his fingers brushed against mine where they weren't already joined, tracing a light path across my knuckles with a touch so careful it made my breath catch. "Then stay," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet authority I had heard him use when checking alarms and testing locks, but softer now, intimate in a way that made the simple words feel like the most important thing anyone had ever said to me. The permission, the invitation, the acknowledgement that he wanted me here as much as I wanted to be here, settled between us with the weight of inevitability. This was what we had been moving toward through all those months of careful glances and measured words, all those brief encounters in hallways and stairwells that had carried more meaning than their surface interaction suggested. He leaned toward me, then, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. But pulling away was the furthest thing from my mind. I met him halfway, closing the small distance between us. And when his lips touched mine, the kiss was everything I had imagined it might be and nothing like I had expected all at once. It was unhurried, steady, inevitable in the way that Victor himself was inevitable. There was no desperate urgency, no frantic grabbing or rushing toward something that might disappear if we didn't seize it immediately. Instead, there was the careful attention he brought to everything else in his life, the same methodical thoroughness that made him such an effective guardian of the building's security. His lips were warm and soft, and when he deepened the kiss slightly, I felt the careful restraint he had been maintaining begin to dissolve. His hand moved to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with a tenderness that made my chest ache with the intensity of what I was feeling. This was Victor without his professional armor, without the measured distance he maintained during his rounds, showing me the man beneath the uniform who had been watching me, wanting me, waiting for the right moment to offer what he had to give. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside his room, inside this kiss that felt like a lock finally turning after years of waiting, everything felt perfectly still, perfectly right, perfectly inevitable. The key had opened more than just his door. It had opened something between us that I already knew would be impossible to close. 3 weeks have passed since the storm, and the key still lives on my ring, its brass surface now worn smooth by the constant touch of my thumb as I trace its familiar shape throughout the day. But it no longer sits unused on my nightstand, a symbol of possibility that I was too uncertain to act upon. Now it moves with me, a tangible reminder of what opened between us that night when the alarm systems failed and I found courage I didn't know I possessed. The building's electrical problems were repaired within days of the storm, the alarm panel in my apartment restored to its steady green light and reliable beeping. The super made his rounds, checking each unit system, ensuring that everything was functioning as it should. But the restoration of those practical securities felt almost irrelevant now. The safety I had found that night had nothing to do with electronic monitoring and everything to do with the quiet man who walked these halls while others slept. My apartment remains the same small space it always was, cramped and functional, filled with books and papers and the detritus of graduate school life. But it no longer feels like a refuge from the world. Instead, it has become a waiting room, a place where I mark time between the moments when I cross the hallway to Victor's door, where real life happens in the steady presence of someone who sees me completely. I don't always use the key. Sometimes I knock first, a courtesy that acknowledges the significance of what he gave me while respecting the boundaries that still matter, even in intimacy. But sometimes when the halls are quiet and I know he is waiting, I slip the key into his lock and enter his space with the same careful attention he brings to everything else in his life. Victor is usually awake when I arrive, whether at midnight or 2 in the morning or in those deep hours before dawn when the building settles into its most profound silence. His internal clock has adjusted to my unpredictable schedule in the same way mine has learned to anticipate his rounds. We move around each other now with a synchronization that feels natural, inevitable, as if we had been practicing this dance for years rather than weeks. His room has become as familiar to me as my own, though it remains essentially his space, marked by his careful organization and quiet functionality. I have learned the way he arranges his few possessions, the precise placement of his duty belt on its hook, the small rituals he observes as he transitions from the public role of night watchman to the private man who shares his sanctuary with me. But I don't leave traces of my presence there, don't claim territory or suggest permanence. The key gives me access, not ownership, and I am careful to honor that distinction. We talk sometimes in the low voices appropriate to late-night conversations. He tells me about the building's small dramas, the residents who leave their apartments unlocked, the minor maintenance issues he notes in his careful logbook. I share fragments of my academic life, the papers I'm writing, the theories about narrative structure that seem increasingly irrelevant compared to the story we are writing together in the quiet hours when the rest of the world sleeps. But often we don't need words. Victor will look up from whatever he was doing when I enter, and the careful way his face softens when he sees me says everything necessary about welcome and belonging. I will settle beside him on the couch or in the chair near his window, and we will exist together in the comfortable silence that has replaced the careful distance we once maintained. The physical intimacy between us has developed with the same measured pace that characterizes everything else about Victor. Our kissing has deepened, become more familiar, but retains the careful attention and unhurried quality that marked that first night during the storm. His hands have learned the shape of my face, the curve of my neck, the way I respond to his touch. But he approaches each encounter with the same methodical thoroughness he brings to testing locks and checking alarms. Sometimes I fall asleep there, curled against him on his narrow couch or lying beside him on his carefully made bed. When I wake, he is usually still awake, watching over me with the same protective attention he directs toward the building and its sleeping residents. In those moments, I understand that this is Victor's nature, to be the guardian, the watcher, the one who stays alert while others rest safely. The other tenants remain oblivious to what has changed between us. To them, Victor is still the quiet night watchman who checks their locks and tests their alarms, who nods politely when they encounter him in the hallways, who maintains professional distance while ensuring their security. They don't notice that his rounds now include longer pauses outside apartment 2B, or that the careful attention he has always paid to the building's systems now extends to watching for signs that I might need him. But I am always aware of his presence now, even when I am alone in my apartment. When I hear his footsteps in the hallway during his rounds, I feel the connection that links us across the narrow space between our doors. When the building settles into silence, and I know he is somewhere below, checking the basement or testing the emergency lighting, I feel anchored to this place in ways I never experienced before. The alarms still beep their steady rhythms. The doors still lock with their familiar clicks. The building's security systems function exactly as they are designed to do, protecting the residents who trust them to maintain the boundaries between safety and vulnerability. But I know now that the real security lies not in electronic monitoring or mechanical locks, but in the quiet presence of someone who whispers in the darkness, "Use mine." Someone who offers sanctuary not as obligation, but as gift, who gives access not as professional duty, but as personal trust. And I to use his key, his space, his steady presence in the small hours when the world feels most uncertain. I cross the hallway whenever I need to remember what safety actually feels like, what it means to be seen and known and welcomed exactly as I am.